What we saw last night was something I never ever thought I would witness with my own eyes on our streets here in Sydney. This was a failed police operation, and we literally saw the police turn on peaceful people who were gathering at Town Hall last night in Sydney. There are people injured and harmed, and there is a large part of New South Wales right now that does not, cannot, and should not trust the New South Wales Police under the current New South Wales Premier to be able to deal with peaceful protest and the rights of all members of New South Wales to engage peacefully in protest, something that we have done for decades and decades and decades in this town and across this state. What we saw last night was a monumental failure. You only have to look at what took place. The police created a literal pressure cooker. They surrounded people at Town Hall. There were no safe avenues of dispersal. There were people who wanted to march. There was nothing to stop the police allowing that march peacefully to take place from Town Hall as a natural dispersal to allow the people to march as they wanted to from Town Hall simply to the New South Wales Parliament. What we saw was an outrageous doubling down of police pitted against peaceful members of our community. We know what led to this. This was an intolerance expressed by the Premier and under the command of the Police Commissioner, Mal Lanyon. There was no compromise, there was no movement. They say the people could have gathered in Hyde Park and marched to Belmore Park. Weeks ago, the people made it very clear that was not the protest that the people asked for or that the people wanted. What we know, and we have seen before in this state, and I thought we would never return to this, is in 1978 when a state and a police thinks that they can suppress, oppress and control a mass peaceful movement. This is what happens. It goes terribly wrong. It results in police violence. I dealt with police officers last night who I know themselves were shocked at what took place, and that some of those police officers were emboldened, were supercharged, had violence in their blood and their minds, and they pursued people. We can see that. There is evidence of that. Today, I have called on the Law Enforcement Conduct Commission to establish an investigation in what happened last night, into the individual circumstances of police misconduct where there was excessive force and violence, police against individual members of the community, but importantly, an investigation into this police response, the chosen will of Chris Minns and Mal Lanyon. There needs to be an investigation into this because this is not what we do in a civil society and a mature democracy, what happened last night. There are now claims that there was police assaulted by the community. Well, we know what that looks like and sounds like in these type of incidences. It doesn't take much to recall when Hannah Thomas was brutally assaulted by police at a peaceful demonstration not many months ago. And yet we know what happened there. It was the police that assaulted Hannah, and she was charged with police assault and resist arrest because this is what happens in these circumstances. We've seen it time and time again. It is absolutely fundamental now that the Law Enforcement Conduct Commission investigates every allegation of assault on police, because this is the practice when police assault innocent civilians in our society. They double down and they charge the individual with assault police. So we've called on the Law Enforcement Conduct Commission. We hope the Premier will support this call, and the Police Minister and the Police Commissioner, But at the end of the day, that's a call for the Law Enforcement Conduct Commission. If they say they need extra powers, well, we call on the Parliament and we will be seeking to give those powers. Members of our community were assaulted, including MPs who were peacefully taking part in that protest, that gathering last night. It is absolutely unfathomable what has happened. It is really important to remember the police created that pressure cooker. I know myself, I simply tried to disperse, and it was very difficult to disperse peacefully through a police line last night. It took me persuasion and asking permission to simply be able to leave the protest. People need to look at what has happened and understand that without doubt the police operation was failed and it was a monumental failure. I've heard today the Premier and the Police Commissioner saying that what happened last night was a successful police operation. If that is the measure of success, friends, we are in trouble. We are in a difficult period and we need to navigate our way through this, knowing that the right of people to protest peacefully should never, ever be faced with this level of state violence and police violence and state aggression against the people. We cannot allow this to happen on our watch.
Thank you. Jenny Leong, I'm the Greens New South Wales Human Rights spokesperson and member for Newtown. Last night we saw almost 2 hours of peaceful protest and rallying in Town Hall Square. We saw that there was a crowd of people who were saying that it was absolutely morally bankrupt for the Prime Minister and Premier Minns to roll out the red carpet for Herzog. Instead of assisting and facilitating the community safely progressing outside of that square afterwards, I bore witness firsthand to what occurred. My Greens colleague Sue Higginson and I attempted to speak to police, saying to them that people were intending on marching. There were so many people crowded outside of the police riot squad lines surrounding the square that we said that it would not be safe and it was impossible for people of that number to leave the premises without walking onto the road, and we needed assistance to do so. I walked up with some of the First Nations activists to the front of the steps of Town Hall, where there were 2 lines of riot police with horses behind them. We said to them, we need to get through, people cannot get out this way. We were then told by police that we needed to turn around and go out the other exit towards Haymarket. At the point where we spoke on the megaphone and announced that we were going to do that, we turned our back to the riot squad and the horses, and they grabbed a First Nations leader and pulled her into the police line up behind us. At that point, the police had escalated the situation. We then moved through that crowd to check that she was not going to be taken away in custody, and we were waiting on Bathurst Street on a quiet, deserted road. We heard that people were being kettled by KFC, and we went to that area. We brought people back safely to the area on Bathurst Street, where there were no cars, there were no people, we were away from the protest. The next thing we knew, we started coughing and spluttering. We holed ourselves up and went inside one of the nearby shops. We pulled into the shops people who were red in the face and crying, having been sprayed this far away with tear gas, with pepper spray. And we saw 2 or 3 lines of police running, chasing terrified community members as they bolted down Bathurst Street, coughing and spluttering, being sprayed by police. I asked the Premier, and the Greens asked the Premier, what more context do you need to see that this was excessive police force and extreme police brutality? There is no context that ever excuses state police chasing terrified individuals, children, young people, Prams, mothers, grandmothers, fathers, brothers, sisters, chasing students down the street, terrified, trying to escape the police. This must be independently investigated, and we need to know where the powers and the instructions sat for having seen 3 decades of peaceful protest in this city, including during APEC when George W. Bush visited, and 20,000 people gathering in Town Hall Square for marriage equality. The police were able to facilitate those actions. And instead, last night, because of the political pressure by the Prime Minister and the Premier, we saw that those police were unable to facilitate that protest, and they were emboldened instead to turn their violence and their aggression on members of the community. That is an unacceptable reality, and we need independent investigation and oversight of the police now.
Hi everyone, Josh Lees from the Palestine Action Group. Last night we saw the people of Sydney mobilise in huge numbers, 20 or 30,000 of us, for a peaceful demonstration at Town Hall Square to say to the world that we stand for humanity, we do not stand for genocide. That massive demonstration, that expression of the popular will of people in this city was met through really sickening state violence by our Premier and our New South Wales Police Force, sickening state violence in support of the sickening state violence that has been carried out in Gaza. That's what happened last night. This was a violent attack on protesters in order to roll the red carpet out for someone who has incited a genocide in Gaza. That is the context here. We've all would be aware of many of the brutal stories, of course, the videos that are going around of a man with his hands raised in surrender being pummeled by riot police, another man thrown to the ground, 2 police kneeling on him while police repeatedly punch him in the head and the kidneys. We saw, of course, the Muslim men kneeling in prayer, again attacked by police. There are so many stories coming in. An old woman, I'm told, has 4 cracked ribs from her violent treatment overnight. I personally witnessed a young woman who was just trying to leave by herself, not as part of a crowd, grabbed by the hair, thrown to the ground and arrested. Another 77-year-old man was violently arrested. He was punched. He suffered serious injuries. He can't walk properly today. He was then arrested on an assault police charge, only to be subsequently released 5 hours later, when, of course, it emerged that that charge was completely bogus. And that should be a lesson when it comes to all of these so-called assault police charges. Now, we said, of course, in the lead up to this, that the streets of Sydney should belong to the people of Sydney, not to the president of a genocidal state. That is what should have occurred last night, that our peaceful protest should have been allowed to occur. We should have been allowed to march. That's what we continued to ask police for last night. But this was an attack not just on people who were trying to march. This was an attack on everyone who was just trying to have even a static rally, which was completely lawful and allowed, even under all these current protest restrictions, at Town Hall. The vast majority of people in that crowd was not just some small minority, either directly experienced or witnessed all around them really sickening acts of police brutality against people who were just trying to disperse. I myself stood up on one of the benches on George Street footpath with a megaphone, appealing to the crowd that, now was the time to try to disperse, only for people to turn around and ask me, quite rightly, where can we go? And that's what I then said via the megaphone to Paul Dunstan, the senior police officer in charge, who was watching me make that speech, who was filming me making that speech, actually. And it was at that exact moment when I was trying to appeal to the crowd and to the police to allow us to disperse, when the police charged in with horses, pepper sprayed, and the violence only escalated from there onwards and onwards. I was in Bathurst Street at one point when we saw those images of hundreds and hundreds of riot police repeatedly charging at people, pepper spraying everyone, trampling people underfoot who were already injured, already been pepper sprayed, couldn't get away in time, and so on. Now, as I said, Chris Minns has unleashed this really horrific police violence last night. One of the most outrageous lines that Chris Minns is trying to use today to justify that police brutality is that supposedly if that didn't happen, that we in some way pose some threat to Jewish people in Sydney or to the people attending the Herzog event at the ICC. Now, this is so dishonest. Chris Minns knows that this is a complete lie because the people who were trying to march in the opposite direction of that event that was taking place. Chris Minns cannot possibly use that event as an excuse for the sickening police brutality meted out to all of us. There is no justification for police's actions last night whatsoever. Chris Minns is trying to bring seemingly a bit of Donald Trump's America to Sydney. That cannot be allowed to happen. We will not stand for it. We need to stand up against this kind of authoritarianism, these crackdowns on protest, and this unleashing of police violence. And, you know, we have called another rally tonight at the Surrey Hills police station to make that point, that there needs to be an investigation into the police brutality last night, that all the charges against protesters need to be dropped, and that we need to repeal this crazy raft of anti-protest laws that Chris Minns has passed, which has led to the police thinking that they are above the law, that they can do whatever they want, that they can brutalise protesters, as we saw last night.
Thank you, Tim.
Timothy Roberts, President for the New South Wales Council for Civil Liberties. I've seen the Premier in the media this morning and his comments about what happened last night. He can scrub his hands all he wants, he will not get the blood out of it. We have a Premier here who is trying to spin what happened because it looks bad, and not one that knows that he is morally culpable for what happened last night. I commend my colleagues for what they have done in trying to explain the circumstances on the ground, but let's remember, this has happened because the Premier has created this environment. He has pursued a regressive regime of legislation change that has driven us to this point. And he tries to explain that it's the protesters' faults for being there. This is a woeful, shameful argument that denies the fact that at the top of the logic chain here is that this is a democracy. We have a right to assemble, and the people of New South Wales, or a portion of it, wanted to meet and march in that place. They should have been allowed to do it. The Premier has denied it that, but more so has sent and empowered police in vast numbers, 3,000 in tactical blues, to approach and quite frankly attack a protest that was otherwise peaceful. He should be ashamed. I commend those people around me for their actions. I also commend the Labor colleagues in the caucus, Dr. Kane, Lawrence, Murphy, DeAdams, who were there. But I call on the rest of the Labor caucus to bring this Premier to heel or to turf him out. He is unsafe for our community, and his rhetoric is frankly eroding the democracy that put him in place. I was not at the protest last night. I had the honour to sit with leaders in the legal community at the Lakemba Mosque, where I heard the opening service, the Islamic service for the law term. In that environment, sitting in that space, sharing ideas of justice, freedom, rule of law with community, that is how social cohesion is done. That is how community is done. It's not that hard, Premier, and you don't get us there by eroding our rights and our ability to assemble and to speak and communicate with each other, which is exactly what he's done. Shame on the Premier, and if he can feel it, he should have a good hard look at himself in the mirror about what he's done. I call on the government to pull back from this regressive approach to protest and police power, but more so to appeal the laws that are doing damage to our community so that we as a character, as a community, are not changed by this horrific environment towards speech and assembly. Thank you.
Questions?
Abigail.
Oh, Abigail. Come.
Abigail, can I ask you if you're comfortable? How's your neck?
My neck is okay. I've got a very sore arm and shoulder where they punched me. And yeah, I'm just really in shock.
What happened? Can you talk us through what led to that?
Yeah, so I was on the top of the steps where the speakers were. After everybody had gone, the police were stopping people from leaving, but also stopping people from marching. I thought that it would be a good role for me to video from up on the top of the steps where I could get a really good view. And I started videoing and I saw police intimidating people. There was a young kid they were chasing at one point. There was a bunch of things going on, so I just was videoing. There's just a few of us up on those steps. I saw as the horses were coming in, and I videoed as the police were just running at groups of people, and sort of corralling them into an area. Up on the steps, I was really out of it, like I wasn't part of any of it. And the police, there was about 6 of them, came up the steps. told me I had to move. I said, okay, I'm a member of parliament. I'm recording to make sure that everything is above board. But of course, I'm moving on. I went down the steps. There was a group of people who were praying because it was evening prayer time. I think maybe 12 of them. They were praying peacefully, and it was clear that the police were wanting to move them on in the middle of their prayer. People were yelling at them and saying, just let them pray. It doesn't take that long. You can wait a minute. And there was plenty of room on the other side of them for the police to be pushing people around. They didn't have to go through the group of people who were praying. I was just right near that group. Again, I told them I was a member of parliament. I couldn't go forward because there was a group of people there that I would be trampling on if I did. And then the next thing I knew, I had this force on the right of me. I got lifted off the ground, and then you can see in the video as I'm trying to regain my balance, another police officer punches me in the head, and then I get another one after that punches me in the shoulder. I don't understand how that is a proportionate response to anything. I was not doing the wrong thing, and nor was anybody around me. They then went in and grabbed these people who were praying. They can't get anything more peaceful than prayer, picking them up and just throwing them on the ground again. These people were just treated so incredibly poorly. That is not social cohesion. This was a peaceful protest standing for people who were protesting a genocide on the other side of the world, but had made it explicit that we were inclusive of Jewish people. There was nothing like we are against anti-Semitism. This was a peaceful protest full of love and compassion. And then we had a police force that came in, made sure we had nowhere to go, and just pushed people into the most unsafe situations and then grabbed them and threw them. I had a guy next to me, 78 years old. They pulled his arm backwards so hard, his skin split and he was bleeding everywhere. It was horrific. And to think that this happens on the streets of Sydney, I'm sorry, I'm in shock.
Abigail, you just have an introduction with the Police Commissioner outlined inside the Parliament. Can you just talk us through that, what he said in that exchange?
I told him what had happened and I asked him if he was going to hold those police officers responsible for what they had done. I'm just one person. There are so many people who got hurt. I say got hurt, got assaulted by police. Assaulted. I'm sorry, I'm shocked, but I really have never seen anything like it. Yeah. I have a daughter who is wanting to go to Mardi Gras in a few weeks' time, and I'm thinking that'll be fine because if there's some trouble there, the police will look after her. Not anymore. I don't trust the police to look after anybody. It's just horrific.
Did the Police Commissioner indicate he would investigate the actions of the police?
He said a police officer up to me. Yeah, I'm sorry. It's not about me.
And it's really important that we don't have a circumstance where the police are investigating the police here.
Yeah.
We need to call an end properly to that regime in New South Wales because it's that regime that enables the continuation of police violence. Last night we saw it on a mass scale against so many people, but this is what happens. This is what police violence looks like. And this is the system that we Greens have been calling an end to for some time. The police investigate the police. The LEC may have a small oversight role in that. We want a full, independent investigation into the circumstances of individual excessive force and police violence, but also the entire circumstances around the designed police response that led inevitably to the pressure cooker and the violence that resulted.
Did police have to enforce the state government rules? Obviously not allowing a march as a state government do run emergency.
Can I say in relation to that, Paul?
Yeah.
I have had a long and very interesting history in negotiating city protests with Paul Johnston, who was on the ground there last night. are having gathered in this very domain, when we saw COVID restrictions in place and police here in large numbers, having seen the Black Lives Matter protest happen, the marriage equality rally happen. Now, what I felt last night, and that is absolutely no excuse for the level of individual assault inflicted by the police on individual people, as we heard with Abigail, but what I witnessed last night was senior parts of the police completely hamstrung by the decisions of the New South Wales Premier and by the desire to run a protection racket for people who have been accused by the United Nations of inciting genocide, being unable to have any flexibility to address community safety. It is my hypothesis that those riot police that were in two lines with the horses behind them were told that you do not move under any circumstances, that your role is to prevent a march. Because at the end of the day, what we saw is the New South Wales Police running a protection racket for the decision makers and the politicians and Premier Mins. What was the harm of coming to a closed, empty parliament? Why were people being blocked? And just to say, so at that point, and this is the terrifying thing to Abigail's point about the lack of control of when people were trying to peacefully remove themselves, to Josh's point about asking Dunstan, how do we go, where do we go? We were all in a situation. I rang the police minister last night from the subway on Bathurst Street and said to her, can you help? Can you call the commissioner? This has got out of control. I have just witnessed lines of police chasing civilians down the street with tear gas. You need to call an end to this. And she said, we don't get involved in tactical matters.
In terms of the PARD, the Public Assembly Restriction Declaration, it is important to remember that is made by the New South Wales Police Commissioner. He has full power and full discretion at any moment in time to make that declaration varied, altered or changed. It's simply a decision he makes in his mind and then places it on the New South Wales Police website. They cannot hide behind that declaration and the laws. In fact, it is very much by design, layer upon layer upon layer, that Chris Minns has deliberately provided to create this entire situation that took place last night. It was inevitable. There were and have been legal experts for weeks and months explaining that this is the predicament we're in. And remember, right now, the laws that created the Public Assembly Restriction Declaration, those laws are currently under contest for their constitutional validity in the New South Wales highest court.
Could I just add something? Could I just add one thing to that?
Sorry.
Which is just to say, like, even with all those extra police powers that were in place last night, there was actually nothing unlawful about people marching on the street if the police agreed to that. That was the whole point we were making. So if police are saying they were merely upholding the law, that is not the case. There is nothing unlawful about marching on the street. Those extra powers empower the police to then, if they choose to, wield those powers to, prevent protests, give move-on orders, etc. But that was the point we were making to police last night. They have complete discretion. All they have to do is facilitate our march to allow us to then safely disperse. The thing stopping them from doing that, as we've heard, was a political decision by Chris Minns, clearly passed down the chain of command to say there will be no march because we have the President of Israel in town.
We've got Max.
Yeah, Max.
The government has explained that decision to not allow the protests to come up to Parliament as because President Isaac is staying in the vicinity and they were concerned it would create an incident if he broke the line of police up here. Do you think that's justified?
Absolutely not. There is no justification whatsoever. These were clearly stated wishes and intentions to peacefully march from one public place to the apparent institution of democracy in this state, namely the New South Wales Parliament. There is no more clearly stated civil intention on part of civil society. There was no fear, genuine or real or even perceived, that people were focused on a man that was apparently on the other side of the city.
I think there's another element there, which is to say that at what point was the Premier trying to use the police to protect the focus on the appalling anti-protest laws that are being passed by the New South Wales government and try and turn the attention and create social division at a time when he is calling for social cohesion, when actually he's trying to turn it around and pretend somehow anyone protesting last night was somehow doing it against the people who have experienced serious and tragedy and trauma as a result of what had happened at Bondi. We were not protesting those people. We were protesting Herzog and Premier Minns and his laws.
He keeps also... Sorry, I just want to say also, the Premier keeps suggesting that there were protesters and there were mourners. This is the clear evidence that Chris Minns, Premier of New South Wales, does not understand or know the communities that we are, because we are mourners and we are protesters all in one.
Josh, we just heard from Mal Lanyon saying, blaming some of the speakers last night for inciting people to march, and that kind of caused the violence. I mean, how do you respond?
I mean, if some people did want to march, we don't hide from that fact. Of course, that's what we've been saying for weeks now. The point was we were calling on the police to facilitate that march. That's what clearly should have happened. Last night demonstrates that that's exactly what should have happened last night, and instead we were bashed and pepper sprayed and brutalised, in the ways that we all saw. That was outrageous, never should have happened, and there's no justification for it.
Given the bloodshed, do you wish that you had moved the protest to Hyde Park for a march?
No. We've made many compromises over the last 2.5 years in terms of where and when we protest and all the rest of it. But there are some things we won't back down from. And in this context, when we have a genocide-inciting president coming to our city, touring our country as a propaganda tour to try to rehabilitate the image of a genocidal regime in Israel, we are not going to completely back down from that and be shunted off into some area of the city where we won't be seen or heard. As we said, that is the point of protest, to be seen and heard, and we had 20,000 people come out last night for that very reason, expressing the will of the people. That will should have been allowed to be expressed, not crushed with police brutality.
Josh, just on that point though, the Israeli president was invited here by Anthony Albanese after 15 people were shot dead at Bondi. It's ostensibly not a tour to talk about trade ties or anything like that between Australia and Israel. Does the fact that he's here sort of in this position to mourn with the Australian Jewish community, did that factor into the planning and organisation and maybe the content of speeches for the march yesterday, for the event yesterday?
Look, it's patently clear that Herzog's visit is a political tour. He himself has said that the point of this tour is to strengthen ties between Australia and Israel. That has nothing to do with the horrific events at Bondi. That's about a PR tour for a state. And we only have to look at Herzog's comments at the ICC last night. This was a speech in large part, and other speakers last night, denying a genocide has taken place in Gaza, justifying the brutal actions of the Israeli state in Gaza. These are political speeches, and this is a political tour. Now, of course, the events at Bondi are absolutely horrific. Everyone here is against them. We never want to see that again. That was a horrific, racist crime which never should have taken place. Israel has carried out that on a scale of about 10,000 times in Gaza. That's what we are protesting about. And we have many, many mourners, both members of the Jewish community who are mourning Bondi, and actually many Palestinians in Australia who are mourning their entire families that have been killed in Gaza, who were protesting last night against President Herzog.
Can I just ask, I was there last night, and one of the things that I saw is that obviously where the speakers were, the protest got so large that it went up towards Market Street. And it seemed to kind of hamper your ability to be able to communicate with that part of the crowd. I mean, was that lack of that inability to communicate an issue on the night?
It didn't help, but that wasn't the fundamental issue. The fundamental issue was the total intransigence of the police to facilitate a peaceful march, then their total lack of any planning to allow us to actually disperse safely, and then their desire, their order, whatever it was, to decide to brutalise and violently attack the demonstration. That's what caused the problem last night. We sometimes hear the police talk about the dangers of crowd crush and so on. They created a crowd crush last night by charging into a packed crowd and pepper spraying everyone. I mean, we had a lot of injuries, pretty much all of them caused by police. Things could have been a lot worse.
There was that point, and I recognised that point because I was up near the speakers, and it was plain for everyone to see. The numbers were enormous. There was 20,000 more people there. I don't have a good grasp on exactly how many, but the crowd was enormous. There was clearly that point where it became very obvious, and I spoke with Superintendent Dunstan on the ground and said, this is the moment you really need to change your approach and response. The safest thing you can do right now is to allow that opening and just let people march or walk and disperse in that direction. What was patently clear as well, it was that time of the evening. There was virtually no traffic in Sydney. The roads were clear, and everybody in the CBD was clearly there with the shared purpose of expressing their political views and collectively gathered and marching for peace.
I just want to acknowledge as well that I think in the same way that we heard from people who were inside the square that were caught up in it, I know that there were also journalists caught up in the pepper spray and tear gas. I know that there were other legal observers and medics. We have heard reports that people who were doing volunteer and medic work had their goggles pulled off by police while they were trying to help people that had been pepper sprayed. And I appreciate that this is difficult for people who may not have come to many, many rallies over many, many years, but I cannot reiterate enough that people like Josh, people like Sue, people like myself, actually on the ground at the point where things are shifting and moving, liaise and talk to police to try and ensure that people are safe. I recall one protest where I had conversations because I was worried about the trams going down George Street, and I managed to speak to the person on the ground who was leading for the police. We managed to get the tram stopped because we were all worried about the safety. Reality is that we might be yelling and screaming on the megaphone, but those conversations about keeping communities safe are happening. Last night that did not occur. And the only difference that I can see that did not occur last night because of that is that they were given riding instructions that no one was to be on the street, no one was to march, and that there was a free rein to do what they wanted because the Premier wanted to see the full force of the law come down on those people that have been calling out genocide for the last 2 years. Should we stop?
Can I one last one?
Yeah.
I think it speaks to Dunstan that you've heard all of us basically acknowledge, and I do the same, having his number in our phone and communicating with him. I really want to emphasise the point Jenny's just made there. We have an organisational pressure, a political pressure that is undermining the operational role of the police in this situation. The Premier has the responsibility to lift that. And if he doesn't do it, these protests are still going to happen. He's only going to make the community further unsafe, and he needs to stop.
Thanks, folks.
Thanks, everybody. Thank you very much.